She fled from her father, yet was already carrying his child. A secret that lay buried for decades deep within the Ozark Mountains, in a community as isolated as the very souls who lived there. This is the tale of Martha Holloway, a young woman whose destiny was sealed before she was even born, into a family line where the boundaries of kinship had been blurred by generations. Our story starts in 1952, when the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri were home to hundreds of secluded communities, many of them almost entirely cut off from the modernizing America beyond. In one such forgotten valley, about 40 kilometers from Branson, stood a property locally known as the Holloway Clearing. There, 3 generations of the Holloway family had built a nearly self-sufficient existence with minimal outside contact. The 200-acre property was ruled by Samuel Holloway, a 43-year-old man widowed 5 years earlier after his wife, Elizabeth, died during the birth of their 6th son, who also did not survive. Samuel was described by rare visitors as an imposing figure, with a thick beard and grey eyes that seldom showed emotion. His word was law on the property where he lived with his 5 surviving children. What few knew was that the Holloway family already carried the burden of multiple generations of cousin marriages. Samuel himself was the child of first cousins, as had been his late wife. This pattern, which started as a method to keep land and wealth within the family during the region's 19th-century settlement, had become a custom rarely questioned, even as signs of genetic issues began to appear. Among Samuel's sons, the 16-year-old Martha was considered the most beautiful and healthy. Petite in stature, with long brown hair and deep blue eyes that stood out against her fair skin, Martha displayed an intelligence and vibrancy that seemed to have escaped the genetic fate affecting her younger brothers. John, 14, had severe learning difficulties. Thomas, 12, suffered from a spinal deformity that limited his movement. Rebecca, 10, seemed normal but rarely spoke. And the youngest, Elijah, 8, was born with fused fingers, a condition that limited his dexterity. The family's isolation was not just geographical but also cultural. The Holloway children were homeschooled by Samuel himself, who had an education equivalent to a high school level. Their religion was a version of Christianity with Samuel as the supreme interpreter of Scripture. Contact with the outside was limited to his monthly supply trips to town and rare family visits to the local church for Easter and Christmas. In April 1952, however, this isolated balance was disrupted when the local Reverend Robert McIntyre convinced Samuel to let Martha join the church's youth group, arguing the girl needed appropriate female companionship for her age. Reluctantly, Samuel agreed, possibly out of respect for religious authority, or perhaps because he saw in Martha a potential connection to a respectable local family that could bring new opportunities. For the next 2 months, Martha got her first glimpse of a world beyond the Holloways. At Sunday activities, she met other girls, learned songs, joined picnics, and, most importantly, was exposed to ideas and values different from those her father enforced. It was through these interactions that Martha began to realize something was deeply wrong in her own family. In June 1952, Martha confided a troubling concern to Sarah Bennett, the Reverend's wife. "Sometimes when my dad comes back from town, he looks at me in a way that gives me chills," Martha said. "It's like he sees me, but not as a daughter." Worried, Sarah asked if Samuel had done anything inappropriate, to which Martha only responded with silence and tears. Sarah promised to speak to the Reverend. The following Sunday, however, Samuel announced Martha could no longer attend church, citing home responsibilities. When Reverend McIntyre visited the property to intervene, he was met with a shotgun and ordered never to set foot on Holloway land again. In the weeks that followed, nearby residents reported hearing shouts from the Holloway property at night. In mid-July, a neighbor's eldest son, while hunting, saw Martha alone washing clothes in the stream. He noticed bruises on her arms and a sadness that contrasted with the vibrancy she'd shown at church. In late July, during a violent storm, Martha Holloway vanished from the family property. Samuel appeared in town the next morning, visibly upset, asking if anyone had seen his daughter. An informal search was organized, but no sign of Martha was found nearby. Samuel publicly accused Reverend McIntyre of filling the girl's head with dangerous ideas and possibly helping her escape, accusations the clergyman vehemently denied. The truth would only begin to emerge 2 weeks later when Martha was found unconscious on the side of a road over 80 kilometers away, outside Springfield. Taken to the local hospital, the young woman was dehydrated, malnourished, and as doctors soon discovered, approximately 2 months pregnant. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Martha's story reveals family secrets the system tried to bury for decades. Only here will you get access to never-before-revealed details about real cases the authorities wanted forgotten. When Martha Holloway regained consciousness at Springfield Hospital in August 1952, she initially refused to give any information beyond her name. The assigned social worker, Eleanor Thompson, a 37-year-old known for her patience and compassion, spent days building trust with the traumatized girl. Martha was like a wounded animal, Eleanor would recall years later in her personal diary, which only became public in 1998 after her death. Her eyes were constantly alert, searching for danger. She flinched at the slightest sound. It took a week before she let me sit by her bed without trembling. Meanwhile, authorities identified Martha's family through fragmented school records and Reverend McIntyre's testimony. When told of his daughter's whereabouts, Samuel Holloway immediately demanded her release and return to his custody, citing his rights as her father and legal guardian. It was during her second week in the hospital that Martha finally began to share her story with Eleanor, in accounts mixed with crying fits and long silences. Martha revealed the horror of the months before her escape. "After I stopped going to church, Dad started locking me in the basement when visitors came," she said. "He told my brothers I was sick. At night, after everyone was asleep." At this point, as Eleanor recorded, Martha often broke off, unable to put the events into words. Over days, the full picture emerged. Samuel had begun visiting Martha's room at night, initially just to watch her. According to the girl, these episodes evolved into forced intimacy, always accompanied by threats of punishment to her younger brothers if she resisted or told anyone. He said this was how families kept the bloodline pure, Martha told the social worker. She explained her own mother had been not just her mother, but also her aunt, and that this was normal for mountain families. The most disturbing revelation came when Martha explained why she fled that specific July night. "I heard Dad talking to Uncle Jeremiah about marrying me to my cousin Walter when he got back from the army. Walter is Uncle Jeremiah's son with Aunt Catherine, who was my mother's sister. I knew I'd never escape that cycle." Martha had planned her escape for weeks, hiding small amounts of food and the few cents she got when her father wasn't looking. On the stormy night, with the family distracted by flood threats, she slipped out her bedroom window with only the clothes on her back and a small bundle. "I walked for days, sleeping in barns and hiding when I thought it was safe," she said. "I just wanted to get to a place where no one knew me, where I could start over." Martha Holloway's case presented a complex legal and ethical dilemma for 1952 authorities. On one hand, there were grave accusations against Samuel that, if proven, constituted heinous crimes. On the other, there was a social stigma around such intimate family matters, rarely discussed openly then, especially in conservative rural communities. District Attorney Howard Jenkins, a pragmatic middle-aged man known for his discretion, initially took a cautious approach. Instead of immediately filing criminal charges, which would be hard to prove without physical evidence beyond Martha's testimony, Jenkins asked the judge, William Curtis, for a temporary protection order barring Samuel from contacting his daughter. Judge Curtis, a 62-year-old known for traditional views on family matters, surprised many by granting not only the protection order but also ordering a broader investigation into the living conditions of Samuel Holloway's other children. The allegations made by the minor Martha Holloway are of such a serious nature that this court cannot ignore the possibility that other minors residing on the Holloway property may be at risk, the judge wrote in his August 28, 1952, decision. The subsequent investigation uncovered a generational pattern of consanguineous relationships in the Holloway family dating back at least 4 generations. Parish records and birth certificates showed multiple marriages between first and second cousins, and in at least 2 prior cases, uncle-niece relationships formalized through sham weddings. Dr. Harold Winters, the physician assigned to examine Martha's siblings, documented a series of conditions he attributed to prolonged inbreeding. All 4 minors show signs consistent with recurring genetic issues in consanguineous lineages, including cognitive disabilities, physical malformations, and atypical development. A clear danger exists for any future offspring. While the investigation continued, Martha remained in state care, first in the hospital and later in a temporary home run by Catholic nuns near Springfield. It was there, in September 1952, that she tried to take her own life upon confirming her pregnancy. She ingested a significant amount of cleaning products, said Sister Mary Catherine, the home's supervisor. When we found her, she kept repeating that she couldn't bring another deformed creature into the world, that the blood was contaminated, and it would be better for everyone if it ended there. After the suicide attempt, Martha was moved to a psychiatric institution in St. Louis for constant observation. Doctors intensely debated how to handle the pregnancy. In 1952, intentional termination was not only largely illegal but also morally unacceptable to most of society, even in extreme cases like Martha's. Dr. Lawrence Friedman, the lead psychiatrist on the case, described the ethical dilemma in his notes. The patient is clearly traumatized by carrying a pregnancy resulting from an improper relationship with her own parent. The risk of another self-harm attempt is significant. Perhaps termination would best serve the patient's immediate psychological well-being. As Martha struggled in the psychiatric institution, Samuel Holloway finally faced legal consequences. On October 5, 1952, after weeks of investigation, Prosecutor Howard Jenkins filed formal charges against Samuel, including child abuse, parental neglect, and improper conduct under his tutelage, 1950s legal terms that avoided explicit language about the crime's true nature. The local community reacted with a mix of shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, defense of the accused. Samuel was always a reserved man, but hardworking and God-fearing, a neighbor told the local paper. These accusations must be a misunderstanding. Others, particularly women, expressed that they'd always found something disturbing about the Holloways. Those children never smiled, one church lady commented. And Martha, when she started coming on Sundays, looked like a flower seeing the sun for the first time. There was a hunger in her eyes, not for food, but for something she'd never had. The winter of 1952 to 1953 was harsh in the Ozarks. As snow isolated the rural communities further, 3 dramas involving the Holloway members unfolded. In St. Louis, 17-year-old Martha, now 4 months pregnant, swung between deep depression and moments of unexpected clarity. The medical team had stabilized her emotionally to where she was no immediate danger to herself, but the underlying trauma remained. During therapy, Martha began expressing concern not just for her own future, but for her siblings' fate, Dr. Friedman wrote in January 1953. It's remarkable how, despite all she suffered, she maintains a strong sense of responsibility for her younger brothers. Dr. Eleanor Blackwell, one of the few female psychiatrists in Missouri then, gradually took over Martha's treatment. Under her care, Martha began processing her trauma through occupational and art therapy, innovative approaches for the time. Martha shows a remarkable aptitude for drawing, Dr. Blackwell noted. Her first drawings were exclusively claustrophobic scenes, dark basements, locked windows, dense, dead forests. Recently, however, images of open doors and paths leading beyond the horizon have started to appear. In mid-January, a breakthrough occurred when Martha expressed curiosity about the baby she carried for the first time. She asked if the child would necessarily have problems, if there was any chance it could be normal despite how it was conceived, Dr. Blackwell said. I explained as honestly and compassionately as I could that while the risk of genetic complications was higher due to the consanguinity, it wasn't an absolute certainty. While Martha slowly rebuilt hope in St. Louis, her siblings' situation became the subject of intense legal and social debate. After Samuel's arrest, the 4 minors were temporarily placed with different foster families, a move the Child Welfare Department said was necessary to properly assess each child's needs. John, 14, was placed with the Pattersons, Methodist farmers experienced with children who had learning difficulties. Thomas, 12, due to his physical condition, went to the Williamses, a family where the father was a nurse. Rebecca, 10, initially stayed with Reverend McIntyre's family, who felt particularly responsible for the Holloway children. The youngest, Elijah, 8, was welcomed by the Coopers, a childless couple recently trained as foster parents. The children's adjustment to these new environments was challenging. The minors show behaviors consistent with prolonged social isolation and exposure to traumatic family dynamics, social worker Marion Hendricks wrote in a December 1952 report. Particularly notable is their tendency to communicate with each other through gestures and expressions that seem to form their own language, possibly developed as a protective mechanism. Rebecca, the 10-year-old who rarely spoke, surprised everyone when, after 6 weeks with the McIntyres, she began to talk not to adults, but to the Reverend's daughter, a girl her own age. Mrs. McIntyre reported overhearing the girls talking in their shared room, with Rebecca describing in disturbing detail the special games her father made Martha play when he thought the other children were asleep. These additional revelations, though from a child's indirect testimony, strengthened the case against Samuel Holloway, whose trial was set for March 1953. Samuel, meanwhile, remained in county jail, refusing to admit any wrongdoing and insisting his family practices were protected by religious freedom and a father's natural right to rule his home. He found an unlikely ally in his court-appointed lawyer, Clayton Morris, an intensely religious man who, though personally disgusted by the accusations, firmly believed in every accused person's constitutional right to a defense. "My client categorically denies the allegations and maintains his actions have always been guided by his family's welfare," Morris told the local press. "We question the reliability of an emotionally disturbed teenager's testimony and the legality of how the children were removed from their family home." A third drama unfolded on the Holloway property itself, now abandoned and under investigation. In January 1953, during a thorough search, authorities found a hidden compartment under the main house floor containing family documents dating to 1865. Among them was a diary belonging to Josiah Holloway, Samuel's great-grandfather and the family's original patriarch in the region. The diary entries, written between 1865 and 1883, revealed a disturbing philosophy that had apparently guided family practices for generations. "The outside world is contaminated, but we Holloways will keep our blood pure," Josiah wrote in 1872. "Every union with outsiders dilutes our essence. Every marriage within the family strengthens our legacy. This is how we survive when others fail." Other entries described how Josiah had gradually isolated his family from the wider community, establishing a belief system that mixed distorted Bible interpretations with popular pseudoscientific theories of the late 19th century. A particularly revealing 1879 entry described how Josiah had arranged the marriage of his eldest daughter, then 14, to her own younger brother, the girl's uncle. Elizabeth initially resisted, as is her stubborn nature. After 3 weeks in the Healing House basement, she finally accepted divine will and her responsibility to our lineage's purity. The discovery of these documents provided not just more evidence against Samuel, but a broader historical context for understanding how abusive practices had been perpetuated for generations, camouflaged under a facade of religious isolation and self-sufficiency. If your heart has ever ached thinking of the silent pain Martha carried, comment now, "Martha deserves justice." This simple act shows you see beyond appearances and recognize the suffering of those who cannot speak for themselves. On March 10, 1953, Samuel Holloway's trial began at the county courthouse, an event that drew attention from journalists in St. Louis and Kansas City. The case had gained regional notoriety, less for the specific accusations, which newspapers of the time handled with extreme caution and veiled language, and more for what it represented: the tension between isolationist family practices and evolving social and legal norms in post-war America. Prosecutor Howard Jenkins, aware of the case's sensitivity and the difficulty of obtaining convictions in intimate family relation cases at that time, built his argument around the most easily proven aspects of Samuel's behavior: the forced isolation of the children, deprivation of adequate education, the property's unhealthy conditions, and the physical mistreatment documented by the doctors who examined the younger children. Jenkins's strategy was complemented by expert testimony contextualizing the dangers of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Harold Winters presented photographic and medical evidence of the children's physical and cognitive conditions, which he directly attributed to the deleterious effects of reproduction within a restricted genetic group over multiple generations. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a geneticist from the University of Missouri called as an expert witness, explained to the jury how consanguinity dramatically increased the risk of problematic genetic traits manifesting. When closely related people have children, the risk that the child inherits 2 copies of a potentially harmful gene increases significantly. The chances of a negative outcome are much greater. Martha, now in advanced pregnancy, did not attend court in person. Instead, her testimony was submitted as a deposition previously recorded in the presence of a judge, the prosecutor, and the defense attorney. The decision not to expose the young woman to the trauma of facing her father in court was made on the strong recommendation of Dr. Blackwell, who warned such a confrontation could trigger a severe psychological relapse. Samuel's defense, in turn, focused on questioning Martha's credibility and presenting the defendant as a strict but dedicated father whose practices were motivated by sincere religious convictions and a desire to protect his children from modern society's corrupting influence. The charges against my client represent nothing less than the criminalization of traditional family practices and religious beliefs handed down for generations, argued Clayton Morris in his opening statement. Mr. Holloway raised his children the way he believed was right, according to the values passed down by his father, and his father's father before him. Morris called several members of the wider Ozark community as witnesses. While not knowing the Holloways intimately, they attested that family isolation and self-sufficiency were common and respected practices in the region, and that government interference in family affairs was traditionally viewed with distrust. The most controversial testimony came from Jeremiah Holloway, Samuel's brother and the children's uncle, who had been mentioned in Martha's account as an accomplice in the plan to marry her to her cousin. Jeremiah, a 41-year-old man strikingly similar to Samuel, denied any knowledge of improper behavior by his brother and described the Holloways as reserved but decent. When questioned by the prosecutor about the documented consanguineous marriages in the family's history, including his own marriage to his first cousin Catherine, Jeremiah responded with disturbing frankness, "Where I grew up, you marry who you know and who you trust. And who do you know better than your own family? Maybe it seems strange in the city, but in the mountains, it's just the way of survival." The trial lasted 7 days, dividing the local community. While most were horrified by the revelations, a vocal minority defended Samuel's right to raise his family according to his beliefs, seeing the case as government overreach into the family autonomy many mountain inhabitants valued deeply. On March 17, 1953, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges. Judge Wilson, after hearing arguments from both sides, sentenced Samuel Holloway to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole for at least 15 years. This court has rarely seen a case of such prolonged and systematic parental authority abuse, Judge Wilson said, pronouncing the sentence. While we recognize a parent's right to raise children according to their religious beliefs, this right finds its absolute limit when it endangers the physical, mental, and moral well-being of minors under their care. The sentence was met with silent approval by most present, including several local religious community members who had initially defended Samuel. Reverend McIntyre, present throughout the trial, later commented that the case forced many in our community to confront a darkness we preferred to believe didn't exist in our midst. As Samuel Holloway was taken to state penitentiary, a new chapter opened for Martha. On March 26, 1953, at 38 weeks gestation, she went into labor at the St. Louis Hospital, accompanied by Dr. Blackwell, who had become her confidant and protector. After 14 hours of labor, Martha gave birth to a girl who, surprisingly, showed no immediately apparent physical abnormalities. Dr. Spencer Reynolds, the pediatrician who examined the newborn, observed cautiously, "The infant has normal reflexes. All fingers and toes are present and well-formed, and there are no visible signs of the facial or cranial abnormalities sometimes associated with close consanguinity. However, some conditions may only manifest later in development." The question of the child's fate had been intensely debated. Under normal circumstances of the time, a teenage single mother would have been strongly pressured to give the baby up for adoption, especially given the traumatic conception. However, Dr. Blackwell had vehemently argued that forcing Martha to separate from her daughter would constitute an additional, unnecessary trauma. "After observing Martha's changing attitude toward her pregnancy, I am convinced she has developed a genuine bond with the child she carries," Dr. Blackwell wrote in her official recommendation to family court. Separating mother and daughter now would add further trauma to a young woman who has endured more than anyone should. With proper support, I believe Martha has the capacity to be a loving and competent mother, turning a tragic circumstance into an opportunity for healing and redemption. The court, influenced by the respected psychiatrist's recommendation and the case's unusual nature, granted Martha provisional custody of the newborn, whom she named Hope. A name that reflected her vision for the future. In the weeks after Hope's birth, Martha was transferred to a transitional home run by a progressive religious organization in Jefferson City. The program, uncommon for the time, was designed to support young mothers in difficult circumstances, offering housing, continuing education, and vocational training, allowing women to keep custody of their children as they built independent lives. Martha shows impressive dedication to both her studies and caring for her baby, reported Mrs. Patricia Donovan, the program coordinator, in an April 1953 evaluation. Despite her youth and the traumatic circumstances that brought her to us, she displays notable maturity and determination. Beyond her daughter's welfare, she remained concerned about her younger siblings' fate. Indeed, the situation of Martha's brothers had become a complex case for the social welfare system. After months in temporary homes, detailed medical and psychological evaluations were completed for each child, revealing a worrying picture of the effects of isolation and prolonged consanguinity. John, the eldest, was diagnosed with a moderate intellectual disability that significantly limited his academic learning capacity, though he showed surprising practical skills in carpentry and handicrafts. Thomas, whose spinal malformation was the most visible symptom, also had congenital heart problems requiring corrective surgery. Rebecca, whose reluctance to speak was initially attributed to psychological trauma, was diagnosed with a specific form of partial hearing impairment affecting her ability to process certain vocal frequencies. Only Elijah, the youngest, despite the syndactyly fused fingers affecting his hands, seemed to have near-normal cognitive development for his age, though with significant social delays. A case conference in May 1953 brought together social workers, doctors, specialized educators, and court representatives to decide the long-term future of the Holloway children. The unanimous decision was that none of the children could return to the family property, even under relative supervision, an option complicated by the fact that the investigation had revealed virtually all adult Holloway relatives were implicated, to varying degrees, in the system of consanguineous marriage and social isolation. The minors John, Thomas, Rebecca, and Elijah Holloway require levels of specialized medical and educational intervention impossible to ensure in a conventional family environment in their region of origin, the official report concluded. We recommend permanent placement in institutions that can meet their specific needs, with provisions to maintain contact between the siblings and their older sister, Martha. This recommendation, though made with the best intentions and based on professional assessments, reflected the era's predominant approach to children with special needs, institutionalization. Such a decision would be widely re-evaluated and criticized in later decades as deinstitutionalization and community integration became preferred approaches. But in 1953, it seemed the most responsible option available. Martha reacted to the news with a mix of resignation and determination. She understands her brothers need care she can't provide right now, Dr. Blackwell said after telling Martha the decision, but she made me promise they wouldn't be forgotten, that they wouldn't disappear into some anonymous system. They were invisible for long enough, she told me. In the following months, as Martha adapted to motherhood and continued her recovery, she showed extraordinary resilience. She completed the equivalent of a high school education through an accelerated program, learned typing and administrative skills, and began planning a future that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. In September 1953, a significant turn occurred when a routine medical exam revealed Hope had a subtle developmental delay, possibly indicating underlying neurological issues. The doctors couldn't say for sure if this was related to consanguinity or simply a normal variation, but the discovery affected Martha deeply. She spent 2 whole nights sleepless, just watching her daughter, Mrs. Donovan recalled. When she finally spoke about it, Martha said something I'll never forget. No matter what happens with Hope, she will never know what it's like to be invisible or disposable. She will know she is loved, exactly as she is. Martha's commitment to Hope's welfare, despite the traumatic conception and potential challenges, deeply impressed the professionals working with her. Dr. Reynolds, who continued to monitor Hope's development, observed in his notes, "I have rarely witnessed such an intense and healthy mother-daughter bond, especially considering the mother's youth and underlying trauma. Miss Holloway seems to possess the remarkable ability to completely separate the child from the circumstances of her conception." In November 1953, 9 months after Samuel Holloway's trial, an unexpected incident brought the case back into public view. Jeremiah Holloway, Samuel's brother who had testified in his defense, was arrested after an investigation prompted by his own wife, Catherine. Catherine, hospitalized with serious injuries she initially claimed were from a fall, confided to a nurse that she had actually been assaulted by her husband after questioning his attention to their own 13-year-old daughter, Beth. The nurse, alerted by the parallels to the recent Holloway case, notified authorities. The subsequent investigation revealed Beth Holloway showed signs of inappropriate intimate experiences, and the girl eventually confirmed her father had begun visiting her at night after her uncle Samuel's trial, telling her it was now her responsibility to keep the family tradition alive. Jeremiah Holloway was arrested and charged with crimes similar to his brother's. During searches of his property, about 10 kilometers from the original Holloway clearing, authorities discovered a collection of correspondence between Jeremiah and Samuel spanning decades. The letters explicitly documented how the family had systematically perpetuated consanguineous practices for generations, justifying them through a distorted mixture of religiosity, pseudoscientific theories about blood purity, and a paranoid distrust of the outside world. The most disturbing letter, written by Samuel to Jeremiah just 3 months before Martha's escape, detailed, "I am preparing Martha to continue our pure lineage. She carries the best of our blood with few of the defects that afflict the others. If Walter does not return from the army in time, it may be better for me to secure the next generation myself." These revelations not only retroactively strengthened the case against Samuel but exposed the systematic extent of abusive practices within the wider Holloway clan, leading to a broader investigation that would eventually implicate 3 more adult family members in similar behaviors. For Martha, the news about her uncle brought complex feelings. She expressed both validation, as her testimony was fundamentally confirmed, and deep sadness for her cousin Beth, who now faced a trauma similar to her own. Dr. Blackwell reported Martha specifically requested the opportunity to write a letter to Beth, saying that perhaps the only person who can truly understand what she is going through is someone who has lived the same nightmare. Martha's letter to Beth, preserved in the case archives and later published with permission as part of a study on family trauma survivors, became a remarkable document for its compassion and wisdom beyond the author's years. "Dear Beth, you don't know me, but we are cousins. More importantly, we are survivors of the same darkness. I want you to know 3 things that took me a long time to learn but that changed everything for me. First, what happened was not your fault. Nothing you did caused it or could have prevented it. Second, you are not contaminated or ruined. What they did to our bodies does not define who we are. And third, it is possible. A world where we get to decide who we will be." The summer of 1954 brought significant changes for Martha Holloway and her daughter Hope, now 15 months old. Thanks to her exceptional performance in Dr. Blackwell's transition program and the continued support of the psychiatrist, who had become not just her therapist but an informal mentor, Martha secured a job as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic in Columbia, Missouri. Far enough from the Ozarks to offer a new beginning, but close enough to allow regular visits to her brothers. Martha demonstrates a remarkable ability to transform her traumatic experience into motivation to help others, said Dr. William Harrington, the clinic director who hired her. Her natural empathy, combined with her first-hand knowledge of system failures, makes her exceptionally effective at helping patients navigate complex social and medical services. Hope, while showing slight developmental delays requiring regular therapy, was a cheerful and affectionate child. Doctors remained cautiously optimistic, noting that many of the problems they initially feared had not manifested. While some subtle fine motor coordination and sensory processing difficulties are present, the child demonstrates cognitive and emotional development within acceptable parameters for her age, Dr. Reynolds noted in a June 1954 follow-up assessment. Martha had established a structured routine, dividing her time between work, Hope's care, and monthly visits to her brothers, who were housed in 2 different institutions, John and Thomas at the Hadley Institute for Special Needs, and Rebecca and Elijah at the Springfield State Center for Children's Rehabilitation. Though the institutions were over 100 kilometers apart, Martha made a point of visiting both regularly, often traveling by bus for hours to spend precious time with each pair of siblings. The effect Martha's visits have on the behavior and emotional well-being of the Holloway children is remarkable, said Dr. James Peterson, a psychologist at the Hadley Institute. John, in particular, who typically shows little emotional response to social interactions, completely transforms in his sister's presence. His speech becomes clearer, his affection more appropriate, and he displays a sense of humor that remains hidden at other times. In October 1954, a significant event occurred when Reverend McIntyre and his wife, who had kept in touch with Martha, visited Columbia with an unexpected proposal. The couple, now in their 50s with adult children who had moved out, offered to adopt Rebecca and Elijah, Martha's 2 younger siblings who presented the least severe medical challenges. After much prayer and reflection, we believe God is calling us to offer a home to these children, Reverend McIntyre explained to Martha. We cannot undo what was done to them, but we can offer a loving family and the care they deserve. The proposal put Martha in an emotionally complex position. On one hand, the opportunity for her younger brothers to be in a genuinely loving family environment, rather than an institution, seemed an unexpected miracle. On the other, she felt a deep responsibility for all her siblings and worried that separating from John and Thomas could feel like abandonment. After weeks of intense conversations with Dr. Blackwell, additional visits to both institutions, and long discussions with the McIntyres about their expectations and capabilities, Martha finally gave her support to the adoption. The most important thing to me is that they know they are still my brothers, that we are still a family, just organized differently now, she explained to the McIntyres. The adoption process, begun in November 1954, faced significant bureaucratic challenges, partly due to the high-profile case associated with the children and partly due to the era's institutional policies, which often discouraged adopting children with special needs. However, with support from several professionals who had worked on the Holloway case, including Judge Curtis and Dr. Blackwell herself, the process moved forward. In April 1955, the court finally approved the adoption of Rebecca and Elijah by the McIntyres, with the specified condition that Martha retain regular visitation rights. The McIntyres, demonstrating a remarkably progressive understanding for the time, not only accepted this condition but embraced it, recognizing the vital role Martha played in her brothers' emotional lives. We are not replacing Martha as a familial figure, Mrs. McIntyre explained during the final adoption hearing. We are simply expanding the circle of love and support around these children, who have already suffered more than any child should. The transition of Rebecca and Elijah to the McIntyre home happened gradually over the summer of 1955, with initial visits, followed by weekend stays, and finally a permanent move in August. Martha actively participated in the process, working with therapists and educators to make the transition as trauma-free as possible. John and Thomas, meanwhile, remained at the Hadley Institute, where they continued to receive the specialized care their conditions demanded. John, now 17, had developed considerable woodworking skills under a patient instructor, creating surprisingly intricate and beautiful wooden pieces despite his cognitive limitations. Thomas, 15, had undergone 2 corrective surgeries for his spinal condition and, though still facing significant mobility challenges, showed consistent progress in his physical rehabilitation. Martha continued to visit them faithfully, bringing Hope along to ensure the girl knew her uncles from an early age. It's important to me that Hope grows up understanding that family isn't defined by what looks normal to others, but by love and commitment, Martha explained to Dr. Blackwell during one of their now less frequent sessions, which had become more like well-being check-ins than intensive therapy. In November 1955, an unexpected development occurred when Martha received a letter from Samuel Holloway, sent from the state prison where he was serving his sentence. It was Samuel's first attempt to communicate since his conviction, and the letter's content revealed a mind still unable to fully comprehend the nature of his crimes. My dear Martha, I hope this letter finds you repentant and seeking the forgiveness only a father can grant. I have prayed for your soul and for the child born of our pure blood. The world will try to convince you that what we had was wrong, But you and I know the truth of our special mission. When I am released, we will rebuild our family as it was meant to be. Lovingly, Samuel Holloway. Deeply disturbed by the letter, Martha immediately turned it over to authorities and requested a formal restraining order, which was promptly granted. The incident, though distressing, served as a clear reminder of how far she had come in her recovery. The letter that 2 years ago would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and fear now provokes a calm determination to protect my new life and my daughters, she told Dr. Blackwell. He still believes he has power over me. But the truth is, he has no place in my life anymore, except as a reminder of what I've overcome. In late 1955, as Martha approached her 20th birthday, she made a significant decision to legally change her last name and hopes, shedding the name Holloway and its traumatic associations. After careful consideration, she chose the surname Freeman, a name that symbolized not just her liberation from the past, but her vision for the future. Martha Freeman has a good sound to it, she commented during the simple legal procedure that made the change official. It's a name hope and I can carry with pride. The following years brought gradual stability and steady achievements. Martha continued to advance in her career, eventually becoming the social services coordinator at the clinic, a position that allowed her to help other families in crisis. Hope, while continuing to face some mild cognitive challenges, grew into a happy and socially well-adjusted child with a particular talent for music and art. Rebecca and Elijah thrived in the loving environment of the McIntyre home, each progressing beyond doctors' initial expectations. Rebecca, whose partial hearing was eventually corrected with then experimental technology, developed a love for literature and writing, often creating elaborate stories to entertain her younger brother. Elijah, after corrective surgery to separate some of his fused fingers, revealed a talent for technical drawing that would eventually lead to a career in architectural drafting. John and Thomas, though they remained institutionalized due to their more complex needs, also found ways to develop their own strengths and talents within their limitations. Martha never failed to visit them, keeping the family bond alive even when others might have considered it a closed chapter. In 1962, a decade after the escape that changed her life's course, Martha Freeman, now 26, was invited to share her story anonymously, to protect her privacy and hopes at a conference on child abuse prevention, one of the first events of its kind in America. Her testimony had a profound impact on the professionals present. The true tragedy of my family's history, she concluded in her speech, was not only what happened within those isolated walls. It was also the silence of the surrounding community, the eyes that looked away, the ears that refused to hear the signs. When we protect a family's right to completely isolate itself from social scrutiny, we are not protecting freedom. We are potentially protecting abuse. Children are not property. They are human beings with a right to security, dignity, and the chance of a future beyond the shadows of their ancestors. The Ozark Mountains, with their deep valleys and dense forests, still hold many secrets of families who for generations lived in isolation. The story of the Holloways, while particularly tragic, was not unique. Other families in isolated communities across the country have continued similar practices, often under the cloak of tradition or religion, far from the eyes of wider society. What made Martha Holloway Freeman remarkable was her determination not only to escape the cycle of consanguineous abuse but to turn her experience into a force for positive change. Her courage in confronting not just her father but an entire system of generational beliefs and practices created ripples that would eventually help shape stricter child protection policies and greater awareness of the dangers of extreme isolation. Hope Freeman grew up unaware of the full details of her conception until adulthood, when Martha finally shared the complete story. When asked later how she received the revelation, Hope responded with the quiet wisdom that characterized her relationship with her extraordinary mother. The story of how I came into the world is not my story. It is her story, her courage and her determination. My story began when she decided that the past would not define the future. The blood in my veins may carry the genetic legacy of generations of wrong choices, but it also carries the legacy of a woman who had the courage to say no more and start a new chapter. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. This true story reveals how isolated communities have hidden crimes for generations, and only by knowing these secrets can we prevent them from repeating in our own backyard. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can get to know you and see who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Be sure to leave your like so more people learn about this shocking case from the Ozark Mountains, and share it with someone who appreciates stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history. Remember, knowing the past is the only way to ensure these cycles don't repeat in the future. Martha's courage is a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there is always a path to the light.